Welcome to part 2 of this Voron 0.2 build. This video will focus on the motors and everything that's required to mount them. To start off, we need the pulleys. In this case, I'm showing you just one. I'm using Loctite because it's a really good idea on the grub screws of the pulley. And there is one of the XY motors as well as the 3D printed tool to help guide or position the pulleys. So here I'm inserting a little bit of Loctite in the threads. Most people probably prefer to put it on the actual grub screw directly, but hey, old habits die hard. This is the way I do it. This is also probably a little bit messier. Make sure you do this for both grub screws. And then when you insert the pulley, make sure at least one of the grub screws is positioned. So when it's tightened down, it tightens down against the flat side of the shaft. And here I'm using the A side of the template. When you do the other motor, you're going to flip the pulley around vertically, and then you will use the B setting on the little alignment tool that's 3D printed. And here I am checking. Make sure you check your work, check it multiple times. It's better to find out now than later that you might need to make some adjustments. And once that's done, be careful, clean up any messes you might have made, and then go ahead and do the second motor, but again, using the guide for B. And there I am checking one more time. Next, we need to assemble the motor mounts. And these are the standard size screws, the 35mm screws. And here I'm inserting one of the spacers. The bearings, make sure they're aligned correctly so they work as a pulley. 2 spacers. And then the next set of bearings, again, making sure they're aligned properly, along with a spacer. Now, I also went ahead and inserted a nut here, and this is temporary. This isn't going to be here for long term. It's mainly just to hold this together now temporarily because I found they kept falling apart. And then for the second set of bearings here, for the A drive, there's this aluminum spacer that goes first. When you do the B drive, that aluminum spacer goes last after the pulleys and the spacers are inserted. And this only gets one set. And again, I'm going to install a nut here just to make sure this holds together until I'm ready to assemble this. We'll take these off in a little bit. So to assemble these are keyed, so they only go one way. And I'm just taking off the nuts that I just put on so I can assemble these 2 halves and then reattach the nuts. Again, holding everything together, not necessarily super tight right now. And then take a set of calipers just to make sure that the spacing is 18 millimeters. And that looks just about right. The build manual identifies 35mm screws, but if you're using CNC parts, you can see that 35mm are too large. And so I ended up using 16mm screws here to tighten these two together. And you should have enough screws if you have a kit to be able to do this. But again, just mount these two screws. And again, do this for the B drive as well. Next, we mount the motors. The instructions tell you to use 35mm screws, and I'm sure that's perfectly fine when you're using the 3D printed parts. But if your mounts are made out of CNC machined aluminum here, you'll actually have to use the screws that are 5mm shorter. And although here right now you see me working with a single washer, I actually ended up using 3 washers per screw to make this mount properly. And again, all the parts you need should be in the kit, or at least in this case, in the Siboor kit. But again, just be aware you may have to make some adjustments here. And then once assembled, assemble the B mount as well. Once these are assembled, just some things to check. Make sure the wire for the motor is lined up with the knob, and also make sure the pulley is aligned up with the 2 idlers. And once you do, you should be okay. And again, here you can see the differences between the size screws that I used. And again, I ended up using 3 washers per screw. And now we need to mount the motor mounts themselves. We inserted some temporary nuts before, and you're going to need to remove these now because one of these bolts is going to screw right into the extrusion itself, and the others will go into the actual nuts, and they'll go down the side railing as well as the back railing where they will mount. You, of course, will need to align the nuts properly, but it's not too hard to do. It's actually quite easy. And then just bolt these in. And then we mount the second XY motor mount. And again, just lining up the nuts and making sure everything's where it needs to be. And then we can tighten this down. And then just making sure the mounts are square, or at least even with the extrusion. I really don't want these being at any sort of an angle. It probably doesn't matter that much because the shaft is vertical, but just to make it neat and even. Next, we need to install the AB idlers, and we have to assemble them first. If you have the CNC parts, like I'm using right here, here I'm using this, I don't know, bizarre 2-screw technique. I'm only going to use one of these bolts, but because it's really hard to insert the washers and the bearings, even when using a tweezers, I find it's a little bit easier to use this little odd technique. And again, I have a really hard time with this, but simply I set up one side with the washer and the bearing, and then I insert the screw from the other side. And once that's inserted, I can attach the spacer, and then with my hand I can insert the bearing, and then the screw I want to keep, I just push all the way through to eliminate the one I don't want to keep. And again, I just find this a little bit easier. As you can see, I even have trouble doing this. I'm all thumbs apparently. If any of you out there are looking this and thinking, what on earth is he doing? That's the silliest thing I've ever seen. If you have a better way of doing this, please post a comment, and ideally a comment with a link to a video showing an easier way of doing this. I would love to see it. I'm apparently not creative enough to do anything better than this, but again, if you figure something out, please let the rest of us know. And once I'm down to the bolt I want to keep, I'm just putting a nut here. So again, this doesn't come out by mistake, and I've got to do this all over again. And then do the second one. And then you can go ahead and install the idlers. And again, one of the screws will go into the extrusion and the other one into the nut. And make sure you're following the directions and inserting any preloaded nuts that are required. Again, you really don't want to be taking this apart later. Just so you know, I found out very, very late in that I made a mistake, and I essentially had to disassemble almost all of the printer to make sure I got all the preloaded nuts in. So make sure you take care of it. And remove the temporary nuts that you had holding everything together, and then bolt these in. Make sure all the pulleys and idlers are aligned. So notice the three above here, and make sure the pulley on the motor is aligned with those as well, those three specifically. And then if you flip the printer to the other side, of course the position changes, and it's still instead of across the top, they need to line up across the bottom. Again, front to back, and also the pulley for the motor. If that's not correct, you need to do some disassembling right now to get this right. Next, we mount the lead screw nut holder. We do this with 12 millimeter bolts and M3 bolts. You can center this as best you can. I'm not making it super tight here because later on, once the screw actually gets mounted in the nut, I want to be able to make some adjustments. And so, but again, just enough to hold this and we'll get to it later. And then follow the instructions and check carefully again. Make sure you've got the preloaded nuts. I skipped some parts here where I actually inserted some additional ones, but make sure the counts and everything match. Again, you really don't want to get stuck without these all properly installed because you will be disassembling major sections of the printer. And so that was the back side. Here we're looking at one of the sides, and make sure you check the other side as well. And then looking at the front side, the big one is there's 4 that get added to the right side here. Next, you need to install the rubber feet on the base of the printer. And notice all the 4 aluminum extrusions, I've actually bolted those in. And one of these requires some assembly here, and this is on the rear. And if I remember correctly, this is where the power outlet, the AC line, will connect to. At least I think so. Don't quote me. And here, I'm just using one of the screws here to align this, bolt it in, and then mount the rubber foot. And then they get mounted to the printer. And again, make sure your preloaded nuts are all in place before you close this up, because this is essentially your last chance to get them right. Make sure you pay close attention to the orientation of these. 2 are definitely for the front, 2 are definitely for the rear, and in terms of front and back, there is 1 for the right and 1 for the left. And these really only go one way, and so just make sure you get it right. If you have the CNC parts like I do, the bottom that mounts to the extrusion actually is also keyed to fit into the slot into the extrusion to make this easier. And then we finish off the base or the feet of the printer. These are CNC parts as well. Yours may be 3D printed, and these simply bolt in. And these are using M2 hex bolts. And these holes there's 2 of them that are in the CNC parts of the base, the aluminum that the rubber feet are connected to. Next, we mount the Z-axis motor. In this case, you see I have the CNC aluminum mount. You may have a 3D printed one. And here's the Z-axis motor with the lead screw attached. And it comes this way. And so now all we need to do is bolt the mount to the motor. It uses a 6mm M3 bolt and two 8mm M3 bolts, and it bolts directly into the motor. So here I flip the printer over and insert the lead screw nut onto the nut holder in the bed, and then I use two 12mm screws to bolt that down. And then also using the preloaded nuts, I can bolt the motor for the Z-axis right here as well too. I'm not going to torque any of these down yet. I'm just going to keep it just slightly loose so I can adjust and move the motor and everything else here, because we first have to align the lead screw, the motor, and the bed. Looking at the lead screw motor from the other side on the bottom, we need to insert two more M3 bolts, which are in the front side into the preloaded nuts to make sure this is mounted reasonably securely. And also, I'm making these just slightly loose because I need to be able to adjust these a little in the next part of this video. So now I'm going to tighten down the lead screw nut, and this is simply two M3 screws are all that's needed here. And the lead screw nut is plastic, so I wouldn't torque these down. Tighten them firmly, make sure it's secure. But again, you don't really need to tighten them down. And to be honest, keep them you might want to keep them a little bit loose here at first and run the bed up and down a few times by hand. But in general, you can't torque these down too much. And here I am moving it down. And again, I really want to make sure that the screw and everything else is centered before I finally torque everything down. And you'll most likely need to do this 2 or 3 times. I think I actually did it 3 or 4 times. And then once it's done, you can tighten it all down. Here I'm measuring just to try and make sure that at least this piece on the bed is reasonably centered between the rails. It's not a bad idea. Seemed to work for me. And then again, simply move the bed up and down a few more times, and you can slowly start to tighten all the screws down. And once you do, everything should be centered. There should be nothing binding. You should be able to move the bed by hand by turning the screw by hand up and down, and all should be well. If you've gotten any use from this video, please click subscribe and or hit that subscribe button. And again, this was the second video in the series of building a Voron 0.2. Stay tuned for part 3 that gets us through the next major portion of this construction. And thank you very much for watching.